Welcome to The Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. And when I first started this podcast, my plan was to have it be a podcast about ideas. And I think I've been pretty faithful to that. But one part of ideas that I haven't had a chance to really cover much are ideas on religion. And today's guest is perfectly suited to talk to us about religion, specifically Christianity. He is the host of his own YouTube channel, History Valley, in which he deals with a lot of topics relevant to Christianity and history. Jacob Ehrman, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me on.
So what sparked your interest in Christianity to begin with? Because you're not a Christian, correct?
Correct. I never was. And I'll start off by saying my father's side of the family is Jewish, while my mother's side of the family is Catholic, although neither are believers. And basically, I was always an atheist since I was a child. But in about the year 2013, actually prior to 2013, I became a bit concerned with the claim that I'm going to go to hell unless I believe in Jesus and accept Christianity, basically. Although there's countless denominations of Christianity, and some claim that, well, you're going to go to hell anyway if you don't interpret the Bible correctly. In which case, there's 40,000 denominations and more that are being added to it now. So good luck playing that guessing game. And some Christians don't accept that there's a hell at all. Now, there is a lake of fire in the New Testament. You got a reference in Matthew, you got a reference in Revelation, although they're a little different. In Revelation, the lake of fire portrayed in Revelation is more like what we imagine hell to be today. If by simply not believing, you'll be thrown into the lake of fire for eternity. Whereas in Matthew's version, in Matthew's gospel, he says, if you don't give drink and food to the poor, to the homeless specifically, you will, and the homeless are obviously poor. So if you don't give food and drink to them, you're going to go into the lake of fire for an eternity. So then the question becomes, is belief enough in Revelation, or is providing food and drink to homeless people enough to avoid it? Or do you have to do both? Really depends on how you look at it, how a Christian will look at it. And Christians today imagine hell and a lake of fire to be technically separate anyway, but that's a huge mess that I'm not going to spend too much time unwrapping. Whereas instead, I'm going to say it was reading through the Hebrew Bible, really starting with the Torah, that got me to realize I don't need to accept hell, because I never really did, but it was out of fear. It was out of fear that I was looking into the claim. But then I asked myself this question: how could God not tell his own people, because the Jews are supposedly his people? How could God not tell the Jewish people about hell? Oh, we're just going to wait until Christianity comes later, then I'll tell them. That doesn't make any sense. Not to mention the fact that Jesus contradicts the messianic claims in the Hebrew Bible all the time, whereas Christians claim that he's fulfilling Old Testament claims, or that's what they call the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. But Jews call it the Tanakh. And the Tanakh is the whole thing, not just the Torah. The Torah is just the first 5 books that is believed to have been written by Moses. But anyway, the Old Testament Messiah it could not be more different from the Messiah that Christians imagine. But in any case, I'm just to go back to what I said. How does the Hebrew Bible not know about hell, but Christians do? That makes absolutely no sense. And it was putting that together, and really what also cinched it on top of all that, and this was a huge thing. This part right here is what really brought it down, is reading Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9, in which the story goes that basically Yahweh inherited Israel from another god, Ha'el Elyon, a Most High God. So basically, God has a father. So that's just why I said this is ridiculous. No, so the Bible is now saying God has a father. There's actually a similar verse in the Quran Surah Ali Imran 3, verse 180, where it refers to Allah inheriting the earth. Where the hell do you inherit the earth from? Well, it says earth is Allah's heritage. That's closer to what it says. But the question stands: how does he have a heritage if there was no one prior to him? But then again, the Quran uses the Bible as a source to construct its narratives. It's one of its many sources. It also used Gnostic texts and other texts to develop its stories. So, of course, it's most likely borrowing that from Deuteronomy 32. I mean, it's not just most likely; it's got to be, because it's getting the idea from the Bible that, okay, there was a God previous to God. And that would explain why you see strange passages. I believe it was the character called Naaman. Naaman, what he did was he took cartloads of Israel's soil, Israeli earth, and he filled 2 carts of it. And the reason he did this is it's basically a mobile Israel, literally, because he was literally concerned with stepping foot. This is in the Hebrew Bible now. He was concerned with stepping foot in another person's territory, or he had to worship another god. Well, that's kind of odd. If Jews were always monotheists, why is he doing this? So Naaman is bringing Israeli earth with him, Judean earth, because he wants to walk on Judean soil in other people's lands. So that way, God's force to protect him outside of Israel. So that's literally mobile Israel. And you see this something similar with King David saying, "Hey, I know we're fighting over here, King David versus King Saul and stuff, but don't push me out of Israel, man, or I have to worship another god. I have to go outside my Lord's inheritance."
So it's not actually monotheism, right? There's other gods.
Yeah, it's more henotheism. It's where you worship one god, but you don't deny the existence of other gods, but you just don't worship anyone else except for one particular god.
One thing, Jacob, that I get from doing this podcast, and one of the reasons I wanted to do it, is to learn from the guests that I have. Now, our mutual friend Jim Valiant told me that you have interviewed all the top scholars, the biblical scholars in the field. And I'm curious, how has that, interacting with all these, very smart people, how has that impacted your thinking? Has it helped you to grow in your views? Has it expanded your views?
It has helped me to grow, and it's helped me understand the text better, also to an extent, the dating of the text. But there's a lot of ripples going on in academia right now. There's a lot of differences between European scholarship and American scholarship that a lot of people don't realize, and also Israeli scholarship. Like, there are scholars that are pushing the dating of the Torah as late as the 3rd century BCE, and saying that there's no evidence that the Torah existed prior to the 3rd century BCE. Something that I didn't really talk about, not in many years, is in my earlier days, back in not before 2020, not before 2013, but this was actually a little later. It was like 2017, 2018. I believe the Torah was written in the 3rd century BCE. That's not something I've discussed before in a long time. And I think I believe that again, because the problem is there is no clear evidence that it existed before the 3rd century BCE. And there's a scholar that I did interview that passed away recently, Russell Gamerican. He believed that the Torah was composed roughly the same time as the Septuagint was, the Greek translation of the Torah, or just before it, at least. And my suspicion is that the Torah was put together in Hebrew and Greek basically simultaneously by that assembly. So it was an assembly of 72 scholars. This is told to us by the letter of Orestes, which Josephus, the first century Judean historian, was quoting from. The letter of Orestes says that Ptolemy II wanted the Septuagint to be created as a Greek translation of the Torah. And so basically, to me, that would explain several things. Why the Torah looks like has multiple different styles of writing, why scholars believe in hypothetical documents. So there's something called the documentary hypothesis, the E, P, J, D, and R sources. R is the redactor, the person that's putting all the sources together. And basically the Torah was a compilation of those different sources. The problem is there's no evidence that those sources ever existed. They're hypothetical. It's theoretical. There's no evidence that those sources actually existed. But if this happened all at the same moment, very much like what Russell Gmirkin said, it's all at the same moment in the 1st century BCE. That makes more sense to me. And that's not to say that there was no tradition before or Jewish texts previous to it. I think there were, but this particular text, the Torah, I don't think it's earlier than the 3rd century BC. That would explain several things to me. One, why do you have Greek historians like Hecataeus of Abdera about over 100, 200 years prior to the composition of the Septuagint? He never mentions the Torah. He talks about Moses. You have a Greek historian talking about Moses and doesn't know the Torah. That's strange. How does that happen? And that's why you have other scholars like Niels Peter Lemke, Gad Barnea, who are noting this, that this text is much later. Gad Barnea looks toward the Persian influence of the Torah, and Niels Peter Lemke focuses more on the Hellenistic influence upon the Torah. And it shows that Judaism also, basically that Judaism emerged later. The Judaism that we think of emerged later in time than we thought. Dating issues, chronological issues also exist for the New Testament. And the academics have been resisting the idea that there's a problem with dating, say, Paul's letters, something that I've done a lot of work on over the years. Now, 2 years ago, I doubted myself, and this was mostly out of fear of disagreement with the majority of academics, but that's not a good reason. And when I rechecked my argument and looked at the church fathers again, I realized, no, my argument was stronger than I thought. So a couple of months ago, I went back to my original belief, my original conclusion that the letters of Paul had been misdated. They were actually composed in their canonical form in the AD 90s. This would explain several things.
Hold on one second. Jim. So you actually have developed a theory about Paul, and I want to get into that in depth, but I want to ask you a couple other questions first, so that we can kind of broaden the discussion and set the table. So hold the thought you're just going to put. I want to ask you about mythicism. What is a mythicist, and do you count yourself among them?
A mythicist is someone that believes that Jesus never existed, so my answer is no. I'm a historicist. I've never been a mythicist. I believe Jesus existed as a man, historical figure.
And is there strong evidence in your view of that? What I mean by strong evidence is not just a preponderance of the evidence where there's a legitimate argument. Do you think that the evidence is so overwhelming that the people that are disagreeing and that call themselves mythicists are basically ignoring evidence?
I think so. Yes. What I think is going on is, here's the difficulty for a mythicist. A mythicist, and I've tried to be courteous about this in the past, to be more blunt about it right now. they have to wish away evidence. You have to wish away the testimonium Flavianum, which now is probably the worst time to do it than ever, because scholars are moving away from questioning the testimonium. They are now heading towards the idea that the whole thing was written by Josephus. So I think we're in the last days of questioning the testimonium. I think that's going out the window, and you have to get rid of it, because if you admit that Josephus wrote it, it does contradict mythicism. Now, I've seen some mythicists dance around this and say, "Oh no, it doesn't. It just means Josephus knew Christian tradition," but yet they want to get rid of it so bad, which suggests that no, and they know better. They want it gone because they know the problem it causes, and they want to sway people into becoming mythicists. So they want to ditch the testimonium. The testimonium is in all manuscripts of Josephus that we currently have. There's not too many manuscripts of Josephus, before anyone comments that in the comments and says that. Like, yeah, I know that. But Eusebius attests to it in the 4th century AD. Now, what's funny is they go after Eusebius and accuse him of being an interpolator. And yet these very same mythicists will interpolate Josephus. The hypocrisy is really hilarious to me. What do I mean by this? They'll make this ridiculous argument that Jesus is a brother, that James, in the James passage, is a brother of Jesus ben Damnius, without evidence, making stuff up out of thin air. And I'm like, wait a minute. I thought we're accusing Eusebius of being an interpolator here, but you're doing the same thing that you're accusing Eusebius of. That's confusing the hell out of me. Oh, but you read it, you can tell. You can tell it. You can tell it must have been this way. No, that's just what you want to think. Where's the hard evidence? And then they'll say, I'm asking for too much. I'm like, well, if I'm asking for too much, that's because you don't have an argument.
Now, Eusebius, you said, I think 500 AD, he was around
4th century BC.
4th century.
Sorry.
80. So the 300s. Tacitus also wrote of Jesus, but neither of those were contemporaries. Josephus actually was a contemporary of Jesus, correct?
Barely. I mean, he wasn't, because he was born a few years after the crucifixion, just a few years.
Okay, so yeah. But he was in the same era.
Century.
Okay,
in the same century. The thing is, they put a higher burden of proof on a historical Jesus, which is kind of funny to me, because I'm like, well, if we use their logic, Judas the Galilean never existed, because Josephus was not a contemporary of Judas the Galilean. Judas the Galilean, everybody except Judas the Galilean existed. Led a revolt against the Romans in the AD 6. He was killed during the rebellion. But he gets a pass because he's not Jesus. You see my point? It's like, but what they'll do is they'll say that, but there's no miracles attributed to Judas. There's no traditions. I'm like, actually, to me, the fact that somebody is imagined to have done miracles actually increases evidence for historicity, because it indicates such a strong certainty that there was a historical figure that that person caused confusion later, and people misreported that person did miracles and all kinds of other stuff, rose from the dead that he never did. And so it's kind of strange to me that they have it so backwards in their analysis, that, oh, we gotta question Jesus. We're not gonna question Judas the Galilean. You see my problem? Am I explaining that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay. Is that what it reminds me of, to be honest, if we bring it to, current times, are the conspiracy theorists out there who will tell me that we can't believe anything the New York Times says, for instance, but yet we'll cite the New York Times when the New York Times says what they want to hear. So they will cherry pick what they want to accept and not accept, rather than applying a consistent standard. So yeah, absolutely, you're very, very coherent and very easy to understand. Now, and probably a lot of people watching the show know Jim Valiant's theory on the origins of Christianity. I'm just curious, do you by and large agree with Jim, or do you have large disagreements with Jim about the Roman creation or the Roman providence of Christianity?
I would say there's a lot there's a lot that him and I have in common, is the way I'm going to put this, to
Okay.
the extent that, so Jim is a historicist, but his co-author Warren Fahey is a
Is a
mythicist.
mythicist. Yeah. Jim just told me that the other day. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen that there's been confusion about that from other people that have criticized Valiant in the past. And his book, when you actually read the book, I'm referring to other people that criticize him about reading the book, and you can see, everybody can see that the book states we do not take a stand. We're not focusing on the issue if there was Jesus or not. We're not talking about that. So it's not saying the Romans made up Jesus. It's very different from, say, Joseph Atwill, who does think the Romans made up Jesus. And Joseph Atwill is also a Holocaust denier. I've had people telling me, Jacob, you got to interview Joseph Atwill. Now, I did interview Joseph Atwill in the past. I took the videos down. I didn't know he was a Holocaust denier.
Good for you, Jacob.
Oh, thank you. Until I found out in early 2023 when a concerned fan contacted me, spoke with that fan on the phone. And then I watched a very disturbing recording online, and I realized, oh, he's a Holocaust denier. I called Joseph Atwill on the phone. Like, I don't know how you're going to possibly explain any of this to me. Actually, let me reframe the chronology because some of that's wrong. The phone call was before I listened to that interview and found out with certainty that he's a Holocaust denier. Now, he kind of admitted it on the phone, but danced around it. But I'm like, yeah, he was trying to hide this from me because he knew how I was going to react. That's pretty obvious. So that was over with. Took the videos down. Not having the guy on, never having the guy on again. That's clear. And so, well, there are times I've deplatformed someone in the past and changed my mind when after checking it and said, no, this was a bad decision. Atwill was not a bad decision. He's staying off the show for good. And I happen to think that he ripped off Valiant's theory, but people will be like, wait a minute, how is that possible? Because Creating Christ was published much more recently, like 8-9 years ago, around that. Well, this is because Valiant published an article in the Objectivist Journal in the late 1990s discussing the parallels between Jesus and Titus. So yeah, he did talk about this way before Atwill. But Atwill, I think, took it into the wrong direction and when most people attack Roman provenance, they're attacking it because of Atwill. You'll notice that right away. Most of the hatred and vitriol is directed against Atwill. And so Atwill perverted the theory, and that's basically where I'm going to leave it. And I'll say one more thing about that. He doesn't just think that Jesus was made up by the Romans. He thinks Paul was made up by the Romans too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Jim's theory is not that the Romans made up the historical figure Jesus. Jim's theory is that the Romans invented the idea of a redemptive Messiah that was very peaceful and, wanted the people not to fight and, obey governments and that sort of thing. It has nothing to do with the historical accuracy, or rather the historical existence of Jesus, just with the religion of Christianity and the concept of Messiah that's taught in it. Okay, so now you did mention the whether Paul existed historically, and you've had some time. We went over it a little bit, and you told me your theory, and I thought it to be very fascinating. So I'm just going to let you go because it's your theory, and it's while you've been thinking about it for a long time, you've just recently basically solidified it in your own thinking. Correct? That this is the accurate way to view things. So just let her rip and tell us what your theory is.
Yeah, I'm going to further solidify it because I'm working on the paper actively. I still have to put some more work into it before it's done. It's getting there. It's going to be in Dr. Robert Price's Journal of Higher Criticism. when it comes out. So basically, the question starts like this. What evidence is there that Paul wrote in the AD 50s? Now, here's an issue I want to get out the way before I explain this whole thing. A historical Paul and when he wrote has nothing to do with rather if Jesus existed or not. A lot of people tend to lump that in together. No. Well, at least I'll say some people lump that in together. No, one has nothing to do with the other. You don't need Paul's letters to know that Jesus existed. Now, let's get back to the formation of the letters. Josephus mentions Jesus Christ, James, who is supposedly his brother, and John the Baptist. He never mentions Paul. You know who else never mentions Paul? Justin Martyr in the 2nd century AD. Major church father, never mentions Paul. Ever. Now that's weird. How is Justin Martyr around 150 AD? Knows nothing about Paul. Or at least never mentions him, at least. Now that's kind of startling. Let's get back to Josephus not mentioning Paul. Josephus is aware enough that he'll talk about Jesus. He knows that there's Christians, at least he calls them Christians. He notes that both Jews and Hellenists had followed Jesus. So he knows that the movement is large enough to make mention of it. Pliny the Younger, writing around AD 112, said that in the early AD 90s, Christianity had reached its peak. Well, that's not a coincidence, because Josephus' Antiquities comes out then and mentions them. All right, so now that we got that correlation out of the way, if Josephus is aware enough, which he is, it's not really an if, it is so, that he's aware enough that he's going to talk about Jesus, but he doesn't talk about Paul. Why does he not talk about Paul? That's a question that must be answered. And some people will be like, well, Paul wasn't well known enough. That's why Josephus didn't talk about him. Well, if we believe everything the Acts of the Apostles says, he certainly would have known about him due to his encounter with Roman governors and also major political figures like Herod Agrippa the second, and Governor Felix, people like that. I might have gotten a name confused there, but he meets major political figures, Proconsul Sergius Paulus of Cyprus in the 1st century. Although there's evidence indicating that that person lived in the 2nd century, from what I've seen. But to focus on the more concrete evidence, what about Clement? Now, Clement is writing in the AD 90s. He writes a letter to the Corinthians. There's also the Clementine Recognitions. I do think he wrote the Clementine Recognitions. Now, this is a very radical position. The Recognitions is usually regarded as pseudo-Clementine. But when I've read it, it seems to be so ignorant, so astonishingly ignorant of later Christian theological views and history. I don't think it is a 3rd, 4th, or 5th century text. I think Clement really did write it. Now, Origen of Alexandria knows about it. He mentioned travels of Clement in 10 books in the 3rd century. He's writing in the 3rd century, and he mentioned this. Well, the Recognitions of Clement is 10 books. So, then I got that out of the way. Let's go back to 1st Clement, which the majority of scholars accept is Clementine. It mentions Paul, and it mentions a letter, one letter by Paul. That's it. It doesn't seem to really know anything about Paul's vision. Certainly not the kind that we get in the New Testament. It talks about Paul being imprisoned 7 times. The New Testament does not mention Paul's imprisonment happening 7 times. So that's a problem. How does Clement only know a letter? Who else does Clement not mention? Never mentions Timothy, never mentions Silas, and never mentions Sophanes and Tertius. All of Paul's co-authors are not mentioned in 1 Clement. Oh, while I'm at it, the whole Clementine recognitions never mentions them either. Okay. So the co-authors are not even known. I started getting a larger picture of the issue when looking at the Acts of Timothy, a late 2nd century document written by Polycrates of Ephesus. And it's basically telling us that Timothy died at the end of Emperor Domitian's reign, AD 96, when he was in Ephesus, disturbing the pagans, causing a disturbance of the pagans, and it caused them to kill him. Wait a minute, how did Timothy die in AD 96? I thought Paul wrote in the 50s or 40s AD, if not earlier. If a co-writer for Paul died in AD 96, he had to live one hell of a long life for that time period. That's strange. It gets worse. When you read Jerome, who's writing in the 4th century, he mentions a work by Epaphroditus. Well, here's the way I'll put it. He mentions getting his information and it's related to Epaphroditus. I interpret it as to mean it came from a lost work by Epaphroditus, or Epaphras is how he puts it, because Epaphroditus was also called Epaphras in Paul's letters. Now, what did this guy say? After AD 70, in AD 67, when Giscala was taken by the Romans, Saul of Giscala and his family fled there to Tarsus. So by the time they're in Tarsus, the Jews had been dispersed around the world. And then he studied with Gamaliel. Like, wait a minute. How is Paul living after AD 70? Jerome elsewhere says that Nero killed Paul, but he just contradicted himself, citing this source. He never explains this, by the way. Doesn't offer an explanation for his contradiction. So that's a strange thing. I'm not the only one to notice this. There was Charles Travers Wood, more than a century ago, who noted that Jerome seems to be suggesting that the events around Saul of Giscala happened around or after AD 70, basically. Although Charles Travers Wood doesn't explore the issue further. He doesn't suggest that we need to move letters later. He's not saying what I'm saying. He's just noting the oddity of this passage is all, briefly. So, given that, there is someone else who is a mythicist that thinks that Paul lived and wrote after AD 70, and that's Paul George. So Paul George and I think the only thing him and I agree on is that the letters of Paul are written after AD 70. We disagree on almost probably everything else. A lot of everything else. But I date the letters a little later than he does. I put the letters in the 80s, 90s. He puts them in the 70s. But we both agree that the letters are written after AD 70. Now, then the question becomes, is Saul of Giscala, that Jerome's talking about, the same human being that Clement's talking about? No. Because Saul of Giscala, according to Jerome's source, was a young man in the AD 70s. Well, he's a young man in the AD 70s. He can't be the Paul from the AD 30s that Clement's talking about. Now, how do I know that Clement's Paul is in the AD 30s? Number one, Clement states that Paul died a long time ago in 1st Clement. 2, he says in the Clementine recognitions that Saul, another name he's using for Paul, attacked James, the brother of Jesus, when Gamaliel and Caiaphas were both in power. Well, Gamaliel the first is who he's talking about. and the high priest Caiaphas held their respective positions together from AD 30 to AD 36. So it can only happen in that 6-year time period. It's the only way. I think it happened in AD 36 when James was killed. And this indicates, one way or the other, that the James that was killed by Paul and his mob happened like almost 30 years previous to the James that was killed in Josephus, who Josephus identified as Jesus' brother. So what is my explanation for this? Is that an interpolation? No. I have to be consistent. I don't believe something's an interpolation without manuscript evidence. The good news is that there is another text that gives us a way out of this predicament. The first and second apocalypses of James. The James that died in the AD 60s, that's associated with Jesus, was only his brother by title, his spiritual brother. James was son of Theuda. That's who that James is talking. That's who the James that Josephus is talking about. He called him the brother of Jesus because that particular James was his brother by title. Josephus fails to mention it was in spirit. He didn't mention that qualifier, but that's what it is. And that's how that James can die almost 30 years after the real brother of Jesus died. And so it is not the same James. So it's kind of ironic. I can halfway agree with the people claiming that the James passage is an interpolation. Sorry, let me rephrase. I can halfway agree with the people that claim a James passage is an interpolation, because I don't think it's the same James. Nevertheless, I think Josephus wrote the whole thing, the whole James passage. Now I'll believe this until manuscript evidence shows up to say otherwise. Now, or if a church father can be found, a text written by a church father that says we have knowledge that this thing was added. Now, there is something like this. There's an example of this where something like this kind of happened. It's with the Gospel of Thomas. Papias seems to be aware of the Gospel of Thomas. He refers to the logia of Thomas, sayings of Thomas, but also you have Hippolytus, who knew about the Gospel of Thomas, and Origen of Alexandria, who knew about the Gospel of Thomas in the 3rd century. Then you have Cyril of Jerusalem, or Cyril, some pronounce it. He lived in the 4th century, and he claimed that Thomas the Manichaean wrote the Gospel in the 3rd century. So how do you have people in the 2nd century, like Papias, know the Gospel of Thomas, but you have Cyril of Jerusalem in the 4th century claiming that somebody wrote it in the 3rd century? You see the issue. Okay. That suggests it was rewritten. And that's why there was a little bit of confusion about who wrote it. And when that explains how there's attestation of it before the 3rd century at the same time, even though Cyril of Jerusalem claimed it was 3rd century. And when you read the Gospel of Thomas, you can see blatant contradictions where it says, don't practice Sabbath. Okay, practice Sabbath. Don't fast. And then the next thing will say is fast. Okay, so it's easy to remove this stuff that says don't, the don'ts, and keep the do's. And you pretty much get the idea what the original text says. But I know that that's justified because we have ancient attestation that something like that happened. The text was in fact messed with. We may not have the manuscript evidence in this case, but we're being told this. And when you read the text, it fits with what we're being told at the same time. You see what I'm trying to say? But to finish on Paul, when did the original Paul die? Paul the Apostle, the real one, not the one who assumes his authority and writes the epistles in the AD 90s. When did the real Paul die? The one Clement's talking about. If you look at what Clement says, this Paul made it furthest west of the empire. And when you read Romans 15, it says that Paul is planning to go to Hispania. He never says he made it. So where did Clement get his information from? I'm saying this to that way people will know he's not getting this information from the epistles. He's getting this information from something else, somewhere else. You see? Now, Clement says Paul was killed. A lot of people don't realize this. Paul was killed by rival believers, people that were jealous and envious of him. Oscar Coleman, New Testament scholar, living in the early 20th century, made note of this. He says that other Christians killed Paul. Quite the twist, because we're told Romans killed Paul. No, it was other believers that did. Now, that's what Clement says, so I believe that's true. I believe that's historical. What Christian in their right mind would make that up? That doesn't make any sense. That's like saying Timothy was killed by other people, by pagans in Ephesus, by Greeks, not Romans, who were worshiping Artemis or Diana. Well, actually, I should slightly correct myself there. It's like, well, what I mean is, regardless of who killed him in Ephesus, it wasn't the Roman government, is really what I meant to say. So he was killed by people worshiping the goddess Artemis or Diana, same goddess in Ephesus. So when did the original Paul die? Well, he was in Spain. I think there's a little doubt he moved there because of what happened with James, his involvement in James's death. This happened in AD 36. Shortly after that, John the Baptist was killed, as Josephus reports, in about AD 37. A lot of people put it in 36. I think it's more like AD 37, but it doesn't really matter. I say AD 37. The outcome will be the same. Herod Antipas is removed from power. Pontius Pilate is removed from power. Caiaphas, the high priest, is removed from power. Because we have James's death that happened. The original James, the brother of Jesus, was killed in AD 36. Josephus does not talk about that. But he does talk about the Samaritan massacre, which happened between James's death and John the Baptist's death. So you had the Samaritan massacre. You had John the Baptist's death. It was causing an uproar, the combination of those things. Then you had Herod Antipas going to war with King Aretas of Nicomedia, which in 2 Corinthians, Paul says he fled from King Aretas. Now that's the letter writing Paul who is copying details of the original Paul's life onto himself. Because when you go to 1 Corinthians, it turns out that he says ektromati, a Greek word for suggesting out of time. So he's saying, I'm born out of time. Like, what do you mean you're born out of time? It's odd. I looked into other Greek uses of the word ektromati. Didn't get a whole lot of help from that. So I kept looking at 1 Corinthians. I'm like, this is really odd. He talks about Cephas, then the 500, then James getting visions. And then he says, I was born out of time, when he talks about himself getting a vision. I'm like, make up your mind, Paul. Are you contemporary of these people or not? Are you the person you claim to be? Or is some kind of identity theft going on here on a massive scale? So I'll come back to that in a second. The original Paul, I believe, was killed in AD 39. How do I arrive at that conclusion? Because Josephus in the Jewish War says Herod Antipas was exiled to Spain in AD 39. And this is, of course, where Herod Antipas dies. If Antipas is dead, he can't protect Paul. And then Antipas was also getting replaced at the same time, because Herod Agrippa I, I believe it was Herod Agrippa I, that took his place. All right. That's why I think Paul died in AD 39. There's some correlation between Herod Antipas's movements and Paul's movements in 1 Clement. And that's how I arrive at that conclusion. But then the question becomes, where do we get the idea that Paul was killed by the Romans? Lucius Carinus in around 170, 180 AD, maybe earlier, wrote a ridiculous text called the Acts of Paul. This is where we get the story from. in which Emperor Nero orders Paul to be beheaded. And then Paul's head gets reattached to his neck, and he rises from the dead. So that's our evidence that Paul was killed by Romans. His head gets reattached to his neck, and he lives again. When people mention this, they often leave that part out. At the earliest text that we have that says this, says he rose from the dead. This is ridiculous. I laughed really, really hard when I read this text for the first time. His head got reattached to his neck. Are you kidding me? So anyway, where on earth did Lucius Carinus get this lovely idea from? I think he read Josephus, because there is a guy called Saul that Josephus does mention. He's not a whole lot like our Paul, but he's going to explain a few things here. This individual is living between Paul and Saul of Giscala's time. He's in between them. He's the middleman. Josephus says that Saul and his brother Costobarus fled Herodium in AD 66 when the rebels set it ablaze. This is the beginning of the Jewish War. They were sent to go appear before Emperor Nero to lay the blame of kindling the war upon Governor Florus. That's what Josephus says, basically. So you see the problem. They're being sent to Nero to play the blame game. It's Florus's fault, not ours. Not that guy's fault, it's his. And let's just say Josephus never mentions those two again, kind of implying that Nero killed him, and we never see them again. Acts of the Apostles ends in a similar way, where you expect Paul's death to be mentioned at the hand of Nero. It just doesn't tell you. Now, why does the Acts of the Apostles leave Paul's death in the air? Well, because the same man can't die 3 times, or 2 times. And the book of Acts never talks about Paul's letters either. Oh, it'll tell you about James. Oh, he wrote a letter. So it talks about the Epistle of James. That's in the New Testament. Some people claim it's not the same letter, but I think it is. So why will it not mention Paul's letters? Well, here's a hint about why. Another hint. Besides the same man can't die 2 times or more, you have the other issue that the Damascus flight is completely different in Acts. In 2 Corinthians, Paul flees from King Aretas in AD 37, which fits the timeline that I gave earlier. Because you have James being killed in AD 36. You have King Aretas going after Paul and the Herodian family in AD 37. I believe that they're relatives, and that's why this is going on. And then in AD 39, Paul was killed after Herod Antipas dies. Okay. Former tetrarch Herod Antipas. So when you put all that together, Acts says that Saul fled from Jews, not Aretas, Jews. He fled from Jews in the AD 60s. Wait, hold on. Or I think some will try to claim it happened in the 50s. So you have a 20 to 30 year temporal discrepancy. Did he flee from them in AD 37? From King Aretas, or did he flee from Jews in the AD 60s? And in both incidences, he's being lowered from a basket, by the way. So I'm going to believe he got in that basket twice. I believe there's a basket story in the second incident, even if there wasn't, even if I'm misremembering, but I'm pretty sure it's there. In fact, let me just make sure real quick. Acts of the Apostles, Saul flees from Damascus. Basket. Should take me 2 seconds to find out. Yep, it's fair. It is that the disciples took him by night and let him down through the wall in a large basket. That's in Acts. And I'm getting this from Acts 9:24-25.
Okay.
The reference to King Aretas' flight, Paul's flight from King Aretas, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 32 to 33, I believe. How do you have the same basket incident twice? That's ridiculous. No, he didn't do this twice. But there was a Saul that did flee for his life from very pissed off Jews in AD 66, and Josephus. So you see where they're getting this information from. So they're borrowing stories from Josephus and about this guy called Saul, and they're conflating him. You see, they're adding this when they're remaking Paul. Acts is like a reboot of Paul's life, and he's being moved later. It's like the movie Terminator getting remade a zillion times, and the war keeps getting delayed into the future. And so that's the way I would look at it with Paul. Is his life is being rebooted, his events are being moved forward in time, and sometimes back in time too. It kind of depends on the circumstances. And so you have a Paul that dies in AD 39, and the guy Saul that died, the other Saul, because they're both called Saul, but then you have the Saul that dies in AD 66. So what about the letter writer? How did he die? Well, the letter writer, Saul of Giscala, I believe he died in AD 97. How do I come to this conclusion? He tells us in the prison epistles that he was imprisoned by the Romans, but then that he's expected to be released. Now that's a problem. When you get this picture when you read Philemon and Philippians. Oh, I'm going to be released soon, especially in Philippians. He's really saying this in Philippians. Does that sound like a man that thinks the Romans are about to kill him? No. He's sure as hell not the guy Josephus is talking about. Not a chance. If he were, Josephus would have told us this Saul was a Christian. He has no clue that Saul was a Christian. No idea. Not at all. He just wasn't. He was not a Christian. Josephus does not regard him as a Christian. He did call Saul a wicked man, though. Talk about the one that died in AD 66 so everybody can keep track. Now we're going to go back to the one living in the AD 70s and AD 90s. The one that outlived the other.
So just to be clear, Jake, there's three. There's the one that died in AD 36, one in 39. 66, in AD 39. Then there's 66.
Yes.
And then there's another one that died
97.
In the 90s. Okay.
Now let me try to prove this. So the pastoral epistles tell us that, you see, when you read 2 Timothy, Paul says that he greets the house of Onesiphorus, because Onesiphorus had visited him when he was in his bonds. In my chain. Wait. As if this is a past tense. This is in the past. I was in my chain. Do you know what's funny about that? Is the pastoral epistles are held to be Paul's last letters, typically. I'm like, wait. Because people are saying this is right before Paul gets beheaded. He just mentioned that his chain in Rome was in the past. It was a was. And he's appreciative to Onesiphorus for being there for him. It does not sound like a man that's about to die at the hands of the Romans. It's the opposite. There was one Roman emperor that did release Christians, though, in the 1st century. Who was that? Emperor Nerva. After Emperor Domitian was killed by a man called Stephen, which is interesting because there is a house of Stephen that Paul greets in 1 Corinthians. Anyway, this guy gets released by the Romans. Paul gets released by the Romans. Oh, that's because Domitian is dead. And Emperor Nerva comes into power and he releases people that were imprisoned by Emperor Domitian. Not just Christians, but Greek philosophers, other people, just this many people that Domitian persecuted in general were released from custody. Christians just happened to be among them. You see my point? So we got a era where we can situate Paul's letter writing in the 90s, the one that wrote our canonical letters. And it fits what the Acts Timothy says. Timothy died in 96 AD. And when you read the pastoral epistles, Paul's giving instructions to Timothy. And obviously, his planning didn't go well because Timothy got killed in AD 96. So much for that planning. But yeah, it also fits what the Acts of Timothy says about John of Ephesus. I didn't talk about that yet. John of Ephesus was also alive in the AD 90s and even into Emperor Trajan's reign. Now, what's important about that story? John of Ephesus had a confrontation. This is noted by Irenaeus, church father living in the late 2nd century AD. Tells us that John had a confrontation with a man called Corinthus. Corinthus entered a bathhouse, and John fled the bathhouse, saying that this man is impure, get away from him. Like, what? That happened in the AD 90s. This is like AD 97, basically. Well, there's more what we know about this Corinthus fellow. Epiphanius in the 4th century says that it was Corinthus who caused the troubles for Paul in Galatia. Well, really, he says Jerusalem, but it had to do with the whole circumcision controversy. So that's how one can know it's really about the epistle to the Galatians. But it was Corinthus who had sent the men of James against Paul. So this means this is happening to Paul when he was in Antioch, because that's where Paul was in Galatians. He was in Antioch. He mentioned he had a confrontation with Cephas, and it seemed like it was recent. And it's all to do with the circumcision controversy. And then the men of James show up, you see. That's interesting because many academics already date the Epistle of James to the AD 90s, by the way. They put that letter in the 90s, and they admit that that letter is responding against the points of Galatians. Is that interesting? So okay. So let me ask this question. Did James wait 40 years to respond to Paul? Did he wait 40, 50 years to respond to Paul? That's what I want to know. Like, well, no, because James, the brother of Jesus, didn't write it. Well, I'm fully aware of that. The letter states at the very beginning, James, a follower of Lord Jesus Christ. Not his brother, a follower. Different James, my point stands. The James that Paul encountered in Galatians is not the same human being that Josephus talks about as James, and it's not the same one the original Paul killed. Paul and his mob killed. Now, some might say, well, Jacob, Paul didn't kill James. James survived the attack. Not very long. That's why in the Epistle of James, it refers back to the original James being killed. Read James 5:6. You have killed the righteous one who didn't resist you. That's what happened to the original James. What you have to understand is that Paul, the letter writer, sees himself as a spiritual successor to the original to the original Paul. So he inherits Paul's deeds onto himself. You see? The James that wrote the letter is a continuity of the tradition of the original. That's the whole point of all this. That's why Saul changed his name to Paul. That's why Acts mentions that Saul became Paul. This, in a way, would make him a pseudo-Paul. I don't like calling him that, but in a way, it kind of does. He is assuming the authority of the original man. And he's being assisted by co-authors in the epistle, the co-authors who are writing with Paul for the vast majority of the time. 8 out of 13 of the epistles attributed to Paul are multi-authored, except for Galatians, Ephesians, 1, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Everything else is multi-authored. That's why there's viewpoints, contradictory viewpoints across the letters and different styles of writing, because he was assisted by several co-authors, 4 of them, Sophanes, Tertius, Timothy, and Silas, with both 1 and 2 Thessalonians being written by 3 people. Both of them are written by Paul, Timothy, and Silas. And I do think that the original Paul in the AD 30s, he did write a little bit. Clement says this. He wrote a letter, but he doesn't say a whole lot about what this Paul wrote. And as I indicated earlier, he doesn't mention any of the co-authors either, because the canonical letters had not yet been written, and the co-authors had yet to contribute to the story. That's why Clement doesn't know them. I end it there.
Jacob, that is a fascinating theory. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. You certainly have done your research and certainly apply analytical rigor to the material. So before I let you go, Jacob, where can people find you?
They can find me on History Valley on YouTube. And I'll say a couple of more things. I realized there's a couple of more things that I could have gone into in the theory, but this will be very, very brief. There is a reference in 1 Corinthians to basically that you shouldn't worship God in buildings made by human hands, for they're subject to the flames. The temple is inside you, not a building. Again, that's a post AD 70 argument. In 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16, he said the wrath of God came upon the Jews for what they had done to Jesus, as a past tense. Past tense. The wrath already happened. Some scholars will try to say that's an interpolation even, because they can't get around it. And I understand why they say that. If 1 Thessalonians is pre-70, Paul couldn't have written this. Well, what if he did after 70? I'll end it there. And again, you can find me on YouTube as History Valley. You can also find me on Facebook. I don't really do much on Facebook, especially since Facebook now deletes live streams every 30 days now. And
it does?
Yeah, they deleted everyone's live streams that's ever happened on Facebook, literally.
Oh, wow.
Every single one, everywhere.
Well,
why they did this, I don't understand. That can't be good for business, but that's the decision that they made. And so I dual stream to YouTube and X instead of YouTube and Facebook.
All right. Well, Jacob, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me on, Michael.
And for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Until next time.